This is the Commander's Beacon, and I'm Eric. And we're here to talk about some unconventional ways that you might build your Commander deck, kind of like wearing a bacon-scented face mask. And I'm not even joking, this is a real thing. Look it up, Google, bacon-scented face mask. It's real. Um, anyways, Companion was kind of a controversial topic and kind of a dominating mechanic when it was first revealed in pretty much every format except for Commander. So, how do we make companion work in our format? So, companion is a mechanic that was introduced with Ikoria, and in the lore, this mechanic represents a strong bond between a human and a non-human creature on the plane of Ikoria, which I think was facilitated by a large crystal called the Ozolith, but I'm not really familiar with the lore, so please correct me if I'm wrong. Anyways, Companion is an interesting mechanic in which it seems Wizards wanted to let the other formats sort of play like Commander does. Let's start by explaining what Companion is. Companion is a mechanic that appears on 10 legendary creature cards from Ikoria. A creature with Companion can be used as a normal card, either as a regular card in your deck, or in the case of the Commander format, as your Commander. But in any format, it can alternatively be used as a companion. Any deck in any format can have one single companion card if you so desire. Here's how it works. First, before the game starts, you'll select a companion creature card that you want to act as your companion. A companion is not considered part of your deck, instead it starts the game in an out-of-play zone, kind of like the command zone in Commander. For now, we'll call it the Companion Zone, but as far as I'm aware, it doesn't have an official name. Now, in other formats, the Companion must be part of your sideboard. In Commander, we don't have a sideboard, so that isn't relevant for us. So, for Commander, that means your Companion will sort of be your 101st card. Each Companion has a restriction that must apply to every card in your deck in order for you to use that creature as your Companion. Let's take Jegantha the Wellspring as an example. And Jegantha requires that no cards in your deck have more than one of the same mana symbol in the casting cost. For example, a card with double red mana pips in its casting cost couldn't be in your deck if you wanted Jegantha to be your companion. Now, once the game begins, at any time that you can cast a sorcery, you can pay 3 generic mana to bring your companion from the Companion Zone to your hand. Then it behaves just like any other card. You can cast it from your hand. Now, you'll notice the companion cards don't have any mention of this 3 mana cost to bring the creature into your hand, and that's because it's a rules change by Wizards post-printing. Companion was so powerful in many formats that they added this 3 mana charge to balance the mechanic. Now, I'm not going to discuss the game balance of Companion in other formats before and after this rule change, so for this video we're only going to talk about the current rules of Companion in the Commander format specifically. So anyways, once your companion is in your hand, again by paying 3 mana anytime you could cast a sorcery, you can then cast it like any normal card. And unlike commanders, a companion will not return to the companion zone ever again. If you discard it from your hand, if you cast it and it dies or is exiled, if it gets shuffled into your library, anything that can happen to your companion once you bring it to your hand, it'll be treated just like any other card. So a companion is basically a specific 8th card in your starting hand, though again requiring a 3 mana additional cost. But as you can see, they're also vulnerable, at least compared to your commander. Again, a companion that is discarded, destroyed, exiled, or shuffled into your library by some effect can't be placed into its starting companion zone instead. In Commander specifically, there's a few additional restrictions you'll need to be aware of. First, your companion must fit within your commander's color identity. In the case of Jegantha here, that means your commander must have all 5 colors in its color identity. Second, your companion's restriction applies to your commander just as it does to any other card in your deck. For example, if you want Jegantha to be your companion, you can't play Progenitus as your commander because Progenitus has more than one of any type of mana symbol in its casting cost. Okay, so now that we know what companion is, let's talk about how you might build a companion into your commander deck. So as we mentioned, the companion mechanic was modified post-release to include an extra 3 mana cost. and this is because the mechanic was taking over a lot of other formats. In Commander, however, Companion is relatively weak, and now it's even more so, and there's a few reasons for this. First, the Companion's restriction also applies to your Commander, which in some instances can severely limit which commanders you can use. For example, at this time, Luris can only be used as a companion with Eili or Karlov as commanders. Commander decks tend to need to be fairly versatile, and each companion's restriction could end up considerably limiting the versatility that can be built into the deck. For example, Umari restricts the player to only using one non-land card type in their deck, for example, creatures. And for a lot of deck building options, the companion's restrictions are even more severe than the color identity restrictions imposed by your commander, and this puts companions in kind of a bad spot. Since they're more vulnerable than your commander, again, they can't be returned to the companion zone to be recast, it's not too wise to focus your deck too heavily around them like you can for your commander. And yet, many companions restrict what you can play in your deck even more so than the commander does. And this makes it hard to find a place for them, because in a lot of cases a deck can be made stronger simply by taking the companion out, allowing you to play those cards that were previously restricted by the companion's restriction. But in any case, after the 3-mana tax was added, companions became even weaker in Commander, and at the time of this recording, EDHREC shows the most popular companion, Khira, having only 1,025 decks, but over half of those use Arabo as the commander, which seems like an obvious fit. But for reference, the second most popular companion is Gigantha, which comes in at a very distant 380 decks. The least popular, Luris, only has 26 decks. Now, my goal is to build one reasonable commander deck utilizing each companion, but I have a couple of rules for building such a deck. Number 1, the deck shouldn't be made stronger by removing the companion. Again, each companion gives a significant deck building restriction, though some are more strict than others, and by removing the companion, these deck building restrictions will be lifted, and the new cards that can then be added to the deck shouldn't make the deck perform better than it would with the companion. Otherwise, there's not really a reason to use the companion other than maybe flavor reasons. Number 2, because the companion isn't as resilient as the commander, because it doesn't have access to the command zone, the deck shouldn't be made better by replacing the commander with the companion. In other words, if I'm considering a deck in which Gigantha is the companion, the deck shouldn't perform better if I get rid of whatever the commander is and make Gigantha the commander. So the deck should still focus more around the commander than the companion. Eventually, I'd like to build one commander deck utilizing each of the currently available companions, but without making an intentionally bad deck. Let's talk about each of those companions now and how you might build with them. Ikoria released with 10 legendary companion creatures. We're only going to talk about these creatures when used as a companion. Again, you could use any of these as your commander or in the 99, but we won't be discussing that here today. And I won't be going into specific commanders or decks that you could build for each of these today. Instead, I want to speak more generally about the companions' restrictions, their abilities, and things you might consider when building them. That said, if you go to edhrec.com/companions, you can find the most popular decks in EDHREC sorted by each companion. So check that out if you want more information. So of the 10 companions, only 8 can be used as a companion in Commander, and let's briefly mention the 2 exceptions first. First, there's Lutri the Spellchaser. Lutri is a 3/2 elemental otter that costs 3 mana, 1 and 2 is it. Lutri has Flash, and when Lutri the Spellchaser enters the battlefield, if you cast it, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. Its companion restriction is each non-land card in your starting deck has a different name. So this is basically the singleton rule, which already applies in Commander, and because this companion restriction is trivial in Commander, again, all of your decks will meet this restriction unless you're playing something like Shadowborn Apostles. Lutri is banned in our format. It can't be used as your companion, or as your commander, or in the 99. It is completely banned in our format. So we're not going to talk about Lutri any further. Secondly, I want to briefly mention Yorion Sky Nomad. Yorion is a 4/4 bird serpent that costs 5 mana, 3 and 2 Azorius. Yorion has flying, and when Yorion enters the battlefield, exile any number of other non-land permanents you own and control. Return those cards to the battlefield at the beginning of your next end step. Yorion's companion clause requires that your starting deck has at least 20 more cards than the minimum deck size. Now in Commander, your deck must have exactly 100 cards, but Yorion's restriction would require a 120 card deck. Since this is illegal, it's not possible to use Yorion as a companion in Commander. That said, you can still use Yorion as your commander or in the 99, but again, we're not going to be talking about that today. So let's move on to the creatures that you actually can use as companions. Let's start with Jegantha the Wellspring. This is the one we've been talking about for a little while now. Jegantha is a 5/5 elemental elk that costs 4 and a Gruul. It has tap to add Wooburg. This mana can't be spent to pay generic mana costs. And Jegantha's companion restriction is no card in your starting deck has more than one of the same mana symbol in its casting cost. Currently on EDHREC there are 380 decks using Jegantha as a companion. Now there are occasions in which Jegantha will prevent you from playing key cards in your deck, depending on your strategy. Most of the time though, being restricted from playing cards with more than one of the same mana symbol in the cost is a relatively minor inconvenience. That said, there are some major considerations that need to be made before playing Jegantha as a companion. First, your commander has to have all 5 colors in its color identity. Second, your game plan probably needs to have some reliable mana sink to take advantage of Jegantha's tap ability. There are some commanders which are obvious fits here. Golos, Joda, Najila, Sisei, basically any commander that can pay Wooburg for some effect. Secondly, we need to be aware that Jegantha does nothing when you cast it. And remember, unlike your commander, once it's killed, you don't get it back. So Jegantha has to stick around for a while to give you repeated value. Now, if you're playing Jegantha as a companion for Kenrith the Returned King or Horde of Notions, you'll at least have the potential to recur a dead Jegantha from the graveyard. Now on that note, these two commander options, Kenrith and Horde of Notions, are an interesting comparison. Both Kenrith and Horde of Notions can return a creature from the graveyard to the battlefield, but Kenrith is far less selective in the mana needed for this activated ability at 4 and a black. For Horde of Notions comparatively, this effect costs Wooburg. And Kenrith can recur any creature, while Horde of Notions can only recur elementals. Horde of Notions actually has you cast the creature, which means it can be counterspelled, while Kenrith just puts it directly onto the battlefield. Kenrith can do many other things too, like drawing you cards or distributing +1/+1 counters. And finally, Kenrith is easier to cast, having only white mana in its casting cost, while Horde of Notions costs Wooburg. So in almost all instances, Kenrith is actually much better than Horde of Notions, even as the leader of an elemental stack. But why do we care about this? Because there is an exception, and that's if Jegantha is your companion. Because if Jegantha is your companion, remember Jegantha's tap ability can pay all 5 mana of Horde of Notions' activated ability because it costs Wooburg, but it can only pay for the 1 black mana of Kenrith's activated ability. Remember, it can't pay the generic part of the cost, so you'll still need to pay the remaining 4 generic mana from other sources. So that means if you plan on building an elemental deck with Jegantha as the companion, Horde of Notions actually has some advantage over Kenrith. But in all other circumstances, you'll just be better off playing Kenrith. Okay, so in summary, Jegantha's companion restriction is pretty minimal, but on the other hand, it only makes sense to play Jegantha as a companion in a handful of decks. So now let's talk about Khira the Orphan Guard. Khira is a 3/2 cat beast that costs 1 and 2 Selesnya. It has vigilance, and each other creature you control that's a cat, elemental, nightmare, dinosaur, or beast gets +1/+1 and has vigilance. Khira's companion restriction is each creature card in your deck is a cat, elemental, nightmare, dinosaur, or beast card. Currently in EDHREC there are 1025 decks using Khira as a companion. This is by far the most popular companion, coming in with more than 2.5 times as many decks as the next most popular one. And there's a reason for that. Khira's companion restriction is very mild, and Khira is really only relevant if you're playing a dinosaur, elemental, cat, or beast tribal deck. I'm going to assume for now that there's no such thing as a nightmare tribal deck. And in this case, most of the creatures in your deck should be of that relevant creature type anyways. Now, you will have some minor losses. Any deck using creature-based mana ramp will need to use spells instead, so you might need to swap your Sakura Tribe Elder for Rampant Growth. Dinosaur Tribal is probably the biggest loser here since it has a few human creatures that help the tribe. For example, Forerunner of the Empire, Otepec Huntmaster, and Knight of the Stampede. Overall, though, Khira is a pretty decent anthem that you have access to from the start of the game, and the companion restriction cost is pretty minor. Honestly, there's not really much else to say here. So with that, let's move on to Karuga the Macro Sage. Karuga is a 5/4 dinosaur hippo that costs 5 mana, 3 and 2 Simic. When Karuga the Macro Sage enters the battlefield, draw a card for each other permanent you control with converted mana cost 3 or greater. Karuga's companion restriction is your starting deck contains only cards with converted mana cost 3 or greater, and lands. Currently on EDHREC there are 163 decks using Karuga as a companion. So here's the thing. Over time, Commander has gotten faster. In other words, players are starting to do more and more on earlier turns in the game. Mana rocks, which used to cost 3 mana, like a Darksteel Ingot, are now being edged out for mana rocks that only cost 2 mana, like Signets. Karuga's restriction that all cards in your deck must cost at least 3 mana is pretty severe. That said, I think it's not actually as restrictive as many claim. Well, with some disclaimers. The more competitive your meta, the worse Karuga is going to be. Karuga is absolutely unplayable as a companion in CEDH, and it doesn't look too enticing in the 8 to 9 power level range either. There's just too much that you need to be able to do in your first 2 turns at this power level that Karuga will slow you down. But there might be some ways that you can make Karuga work for you at lower power levels. First, you can use high CMC cards that can be used on turns 1 to 2. For example, what about cycling? Most cards with cycling can be used on early turns, but most of these effects will just draw you a card, which I wouldn't really count as doing something meaningful, and that won't influence your board state in any way. Now, there are cards that have an effect when cycled, like Complicate, but most of these cycling costs are more than 2 mana, so they don't really get us around Karuga's restriction. Now, one thing you can do on early turns with Karuga is play Adventures. Because the creature side of each adventure card determines the CMC, the spell side can be played in Karuga decks even if the spell side costs less than 3 mana. Now, unfortunately, we've only had one set released so far in all of Magic's history, which include Adventures. That's Throne of Eldraine. So there's only 30 adventure cards right now. Some of them won't be good in Commander, some of them might not fit the color identity of whatever deck you decide to play. And of course, for some of them, the spell side will cost 3 or more mana. This won't really help us with playing things on early turns. So you probably won't find more than 1 or 2 adventure cards that both fit your deck's colors, can be cast as a spell for less than 3 CMC, and are actually good cards. Another option you have is split cards. Because the CMC of these cards is counted as the sum of both halves, you can actually cast either side on its own, even if that individual spell costs less than 3 mana. And now I think we're actually getting somewhere. Magic has a bunch of these split cards released over several different sets. Now, you might be limited if you're only playing blue and green. There are only 6 such split cards in all of Magic's library. But if you add another color, you will have a lot more options. For example, in Bant colors, that's white, green, and blue, there are 23 split cards to choose from. Though remember that not all split cards will have a mode that costs for less than 3 mana, and so again, cards like that won't help us play things on early turns with Karuga as a companion. And of course, several spells can be cast without paying their mana cost, like Force of Will. So you do have some options to do things before turn 3 if Karuga is your companion, but you will probably have to stretch quite a bit to find lots of these effects. That said, I think Karuga's Enter the Battlefield effect is fairly strong. Karuga draws you a bunch of cards, hopefully anyways. That means even if your opponents remove it, it's already done its work. For the most part, only a counterspell will stop Karuga. And if you're playing a blink deck, like Rune for example, Karuga's card draw can be repeated and get out of hand. So again, I don't think Karuga will find a place in a really competitive playgroup. I do think Karuga has potential in a more middling power level group, but it will probably take some creativity to build an effective deck. So if Karuga's high CMC requirement scares you away, let's talk about Luris of the Dream Den. Luris is a 3/2 cat nightmare that costs 3 mana, 1 and 2 Orzhov. It has lifelink, and during each of your turns, you may cast one permanent spell with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard. Luris's companion restriction is each permanent card in your starting deck has converted mana cost of 2 or less. Currently in EDHREC there are only 26 decks using Luris as a companion. And there is a good reason for this. Because your commander must also fit your companion's restriction, there are only 2 possible commanders for a deck in which Luris is the companion. And that's because in Orzhov colors, only 2 commanders have CMC 2 or less, and they are Eiley Eternal Pilgrim and Karlov of the Ghost Council. Now, of these 2, Eiley is much more popular, leading 20 of the 26 decks, and this makes sense. Eiley can sacrifice a creature to gain life or exile a permanent, and then Luris can recast that dead creature to be sacrificed again. And unlike Karuga, when you use Luris as your companion, you don't need to worry that your deck will be too slow to keep up in a more competitive playgroup. In fact, your deck will have a pretty low CMC, so you might be able to reduce the amount of lands and ramp that you play. And despite the fact that your permanents must be 2 CMC or less, your non-permanent spells can be as expensive as you need them to be. Of course, you can still get powerful finishers like Finale of Eternity and Torment of Hailfire, but you also still get access to all of your staple instants and sorceries like Return to Dust and Anguished Unmaking. Now, despite these advantages, whatever your deck strategy, there will inevitably be cards that you won't be able to play due to Luris's restriction. Both Eiley and Karlov frequently use life gain strategies, but you won't be able to play powerful cards like Well of Lost Dreams, Aetherflux Reservoir, or Archangel of Thune. And these are just 3 examples, but there really are a lot of good permanents that cost more than 2 mana that you simply won't be able to play. What's more, Luris needs to stick around for a while to accrue value, and your opponents will definitely want it dead. That said, in Orzhov you'll have access to plenty of graveyard recursion, so you'll really just need to prevent Luris from getting exiled. And if you do manage to keep Luris around, you will generate tons of value by recurring permanents from your graveyard each turn. I won't go over any specific examples here, but you could focus on artifacts or enchantments or just any aristocrat theme with sacrifice outlets. Now, I'm actually surprised that Luris's deck count is so low. The restriction is severe, but I also think the payoff is pretty strong. I'm not sure if Luris can see CEDH play as a companion. I don't play CEDH myself, so I really can't advise on it, but I suspect Luris's low deck count is probably due more to the very limited commander options, again just Eiley and Karlov. But at anything below CEDH, Luris should be really viable. I've considered several decks using Luris as a companion, and hopefully I'll be able to bring one to you guys in the future. So let's move on to Garuda, Doom of Depths. Garuda is a 6/6 Demon Kraken that costs 4 and 2 Dimir. When Garuda enters the battlefield, each player mills 4 cards, then you put a creature card with an even converted mana cost from among the milled cards onto the battlefield under your control. And Garuda's companion restriction is your starting deck contains only cards with even converted mana costs. Currently in EDHREC there are 144 decks using Garuda as a companion, so Garuda's Enter the Battlefield ability is fairly narrow. Essentially, it reanimates a single creature with an even converted mana cost from among the top 4 cards in all players' libraries. Let's compare this to Sepulchral Primordial, which reanimates one creature of any CMC from each of your opponent's graveyards when it enters the battlefield. So Garuda is an obvious fit for a mill deck, right? Well, maybe. Because Garuda only looks at the top 4 cards of the library, there's a reasonable chance your opponents won't have anything useful to reanimate. So when building your own Garuda, I think you'll really want to have your own powerful creatures to reanimate rather than relying on your opponents. So you might be milling your opponents as a strategy, but for Garuda to really work reliably, you also need to be milling yourself. Now, fortunately, many of the most popular self-mill commanders have an even converted mana cost, like Muldrotha, Tasigur, and Sidisi Brood Tyrant. But limiting your entire deck to only even converted mana cost cards is pretty harsh. You won't be able to play some popular self-mill cards like Sultai's Ascendancy, Underrealm Lich, or Taigam Sidisi's Hand. If Garuda's restriction is going to be worth it, you'll need to have a reliable way of getting Garuda's Enter the Battlefield trigger repeatedly. Now, you could consider, for example, playing a bounce or blink type strategy with Sidisi as the commander, because Sidisi's own Enter the Battlefield effect mills you and creates zombies. But even when you meet these conditions, you still need valuable creatures to reanimate with Garuda, and at a high enough frequency in your deck that you'll be able to reliably find one within the top 4 cards when Garuda enters the battlefield. On EDH Rec, the average Sidisi deck has 33 creatures, not counting the commander. This means you'll have about an 80% chance of hitting at least one creature in your top 4 when Garuda enters the battlefield. This is okay, but whiffing once out of every 5 tries is going to feel kind of bad. And even when you do find a creature, maybe you'll get a Sakura Tribe Elder or something. I mean, that's still free value, but is it good enough to overcome Garuda's companion restriction? Honestly, I think it probably isn't. But I'd love to be proven wrong, and I'll certainly let you guys know if I can come up with a reasonable build running Garuda as the companion. Okay, but if you don't like being limited to only even converted mana cost cards in your deck, let me introduce you to Obosh the Prey Piercer. Obosh is a 3/5 Hellion Horror that costs 5 mana, a 3/2 Rakdos. It has, if a source you control with an odd converted mana cost would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage to that permanent or player instead. And Obosh's companion restriction is your starting deck contains only cards with odd converted mana costs and land cards. Currently on EDH Rec there are 153 decks using Obosh as a companion. So just like Garuda, Obosh significantly limits what you can play with. You'll have a hard time finding a gameplay strategy that doesn't have at least a few really powerful cards with even CMCs, and you won't be able to play these. Now, I actually think Obosh's restriction is worse than Garuda's, because with Garuda you can use 2 converted mana cost mana rocks. With Obosh, though, you won't be ramping until at least turn 3, because there aren't many mana ramp options at 1 converted mana cost, especially in Rakdos colors. Now, as we mentioned with Karuga, Commander seems to be trending towards faster gameplay with most mana ramp coming in at 2 CMC or less. And remember that Garuda also gives you value when it enters the battlefield, but Obosh doesn't do anything right away. And despite all of these concerns, I think Obosh is actually stronger than Garuda as a companion. First, Obosh's ability is very strong. Red has access to several damage doubling effects, but most of them are actually a bit more limiting than Obosh. Notice that Obosh's ability doubles the damage dealt by any source you control with odd converted mana cost. Now, since we're running Obosh as a companion, everything in our deck will have odd converted mana cost, so it will double all of our damage dealt, unless we're dealing damage with a land like Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle. In comparison, Gratuitous Violence, for example, only doubles damage dealt by creatures. Fire Servant only doubles damage dealt by your red instants and sorceries. Dictate of the Twin Gods doubles all damage, but it also doubles damage our opponents deal to us. And I don't know about you, but this makes me feel very uncomfortable. And even though Obosh doesn't do anything right away, I can see Obosh as a finisher. I don't think it needs to stay on the battlefield very long. I think once you build up your other combo pieces, then you cast Obosh and deal a bunch of damage at once, ideally during the same turn that you cast Obosh. So I think Obosh is actually in a really good spot. That damage doubling ability is really strong, but you also need to be really intentional about building with Obosh as a companion, since being restricted to only odd CMCs will affect any deck running any strategy at any budget. So with that, let's move on to Umari the Collector. Umari is a 4/5 ooze that costs 4 mana, that's 2 and 2 Golgari, and as Umari the Collector enters the battlefield, you choose a card type. Spells you cast of the chosen type cost 1 less to cast. And Umari's companion restriction is each non-land card in your starting deck shares a card type. Currently on EDH Rec there are 142 decks using Umari as a companion. So Umari. This guy is an award winner. Most severe companion restriction? Gotta be Umari. Most useless ability? Also goes to Umari. Now, as you can imagine, this is not a good combination. Nonetheless, Umari is not the least popular companion by far. Let's talk a bit more about why building with Umari is so difficult and how we might make it work. First, remember that the companion's restriction also applies to your commander. Umari requires that all cards in your deck share a card type. Since no commanders are instants or sorceries, that means that every deck in which Umari is a companion will have 0 instants and 0 sorceries. Now, you can build a Planeswalker deck, but only if your commander is Lord Windgrace. And I will point out that running, say, 40 lands and 60 Planeswalkers in your deck is probably suboptimal. So this Umari Planeswalker deck is unique, but it's also probably bad. You can also build an enchantments deck, if your commander is Farika. Just be aware that Farika is bad, and I've studied this as an option, I've tried to make it work, but Farika is bad, and Umari doesn't make it better. You can also build an artifact deck. Here you at least have a few commander options in Ramos, Golos, and Reaper King, and of course you'll have plenty of commander options if you choose to run only creatures in your deck. But no matter what card type you pick, you're going to be missing a lot of support pieces, not to mention almost any possible instant speed interaction. At this time, I think Umari is only reasonable to build using creatures or artifacts, but you also have to consider, how do you make Umari's cost reduction effect worthwhile? Remember that you're paying 3 mana to bring Umari to your hand and then 4 mana to cast it, so you'll need to cast 7 more spells just to break even on your investment. So Umari needs to stick around for a while to provide value, and as we said before, that really makes me nervous in a companion. Now, I've tried out several creature-based builds with Umari, and it rarely makes sense to even cast Umari. And if you don't cast your companion, then the companion restriction is, by default, not worth it. At this time, probably the strongest Umari build is an all-artifacts build in which Umari is basically an extra Foundry Inspector that you always have access to. And in an artifact-based Storm deck, you can definitely cast enough artifacts to more than make up for the 7 mana that you spent casting Umari, as long as you can keep your hand full of cards anyways. But can you do Artifact Storm better with Umari than you can already do with Joyra Weatherlight Captain? I'm doubtful. All that said, I'm continually drawn to the challenge of making Umari work, so hopefully I'll have a deck tech with Umari as the companion soon. But just realize that Umari is bad, and so any deck with Umari as the companion is likely going to be pretty limited in terms of power level. And lastly, we need to talk about Zerta, the Dawnwaker. Zerta is a 3/3 elemental fox that costs 3 mana, that's 1 and 2 Boros. It has abilities that you activate that aren't mana abilities, cost 2 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the mana in that cost to less than 1 mana. And Zerta also has pay 1 and tap it to make target creature unable to block this turn. Zerta's companion restriction reads, each permanent card in your starting deck has an activated ability. Currently on EDH Rec there are only 29 decks using Zerta as a companion. Now a lot of people were excited about the Firefox when it was first revealed, myself included. And that's because Boros, which typically has been relatively weak in Commander, and also limited to just attacking, got something really new and completely different with Zerta. Different, I should say, and powerful. Zerta's ability to reduce the cost of activated abilities by 2 mana is staggering, and at times almost broken. Zerta is Training Grounds that affects all of your permanents, not just creatures. Training Grounds is $40. Now, expensive doesn't mean good, but Training Grounds is really good. Zerta can do so many stupid things. First of all, Zerta plus Basalt Monolith is a 2-card combo that makes infinite colorless mana. And if Kenrith is your commander and you have Zerta on the field, you can pay 1 white mana to gain 5 life, or 2 mana to draw a card, repeatedly. Zerta is dumb. What about with Zakama as a commander? Zerta is dumb here too. 1 mana to zap a creature for 3, destroy an artifact or enchantment, or gain life, repeatedly, and you just untapped all of your lands? And equipment decks love Zerta, since it reduces the equip cost. Sunforger gets really dumb. But really any equipment just gets very, very efficient when Zerta is around. And what about cycling? Zerta reduces your cycling costs often to just 1 colorless mana. Now it's probably impossible to conceive of all of the ways that you can build with Zerta as a companion, at least within a single human lifetime. Zerta is a really unique and powerful companion whose influence can be both vast and subtle. Now in my opinion, Zerta's ability is the strongest of all of the currently existing companions. So why only 29 decks? Well, I think Zerta's restriction is also one of the most restrictive of all of the companions, probably second only to Umari. Now, whatever your deck strategy, you'll find some key cards that have activated abilities and become broken when Zerta is in play. But then again, most permanents that support your strategy won't have activated abilities, so you can't play them. Doing basic things like drawing cards or ramping or killing stuff gets significantly more complicated when you play with Zerta. Even within your deck strategy, lots of cards will be off limits. Want to build with tokens and maybe Akeem the Soaring Wind as your commander? Well, you can't play most Anthem effects because they generally don't have activated abilities. And lots of commander staples will be off limits to you too when you decide to build with Zerta as a companion. So if you can't tell, Zerta is the companion that I'm most excited about. I've built a few Zerta decks so far, and most fall short, most of them because the companion restriction is really quite severe. But I do have one build that seems to be working well, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with all of you in the coming months. But that's all I've got for today. Companions are an interesting deck building challenge in Commander. The 3 mana attacks that Wizards added probably made the mechanic a bit too weak for widespread adoption in our format, but I think it's still possible to build strong Commander decks with at least a couple of the companions. Please like this video or subscribe if you found any of this useful. I will be posting weekly videos describing all sorts of unconventional ways that you can build your Commander decks, from budget alternatives to deck techs to top 10 lists. And thank you for watching.